The wind shrieked against the cottage walls like a living thing in pain, rattling the windows in their ancient frames. Bjorn pressed his palm against the heavy wooden door, feeling the supernatural cold seep through planks his great-grandfather had cut from trees that once sheltered Viking halls. Behind him, Freya huddled beneath her grandmother's woolen blanket, watching him with eyes too knowing for 8 years. "Tell me again what you saw, little one," he said, not turning from the door. His voice carried the measured calm he used when pulling nets in rough seas, steady, even when the ocean threatened to swallow his boat whole. "The Shadow Man came to Mama's window while you were checking the generator." Freya's words barely rose above the storm's howl. "He knocked 3 times, knock, 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 like the troll in your stories. But when Mama looked outside, her face changed, like she was remembering something beautiful she'd forgotten." Bjorn's jaw tightened. The generator shed sat 50 meters from the house, close enough that he should have heard voices, seen figures. Yet 20 minutes ago, he'd returned to find wet footprints leading from Freya's bedroom window to the front door, and his wife gone without even grabbing her coat. What did the man look like? Tall. Taller than you, Papa. His hair was long and dark, braided like the warriors in your picture books. He wore something that looked like... She paused, searching for words. Like metal fish scales? Mail. She was describing chainmail. A gust of wind struck the cottage so hard the floor shook, and somewhere in that howling chaos, Bjorn heard something that made his blood freeze. The distant sound of oars cutting through water. Impossible. The nearest harbor was 3 kilometers inland from their clifftop home, and no boat could survive these seas. He moved to the window where his daughter had witnessed the impossible, peering through frost-covered glass into the maelstrom. The storm moved wrong, spinning in patterns that defied nature, its eye fixed over their home like a great gray whirlpool. Lightning flickered within the clouds, not the white-blue flash of normal storms, but a sickly green that reminded him of the northern lights his grandfather claimed carried messages from the dead. "Papa?" Freya's voice was small, uncertain. The man knew my name. He called me Little Daughter of Wolves in the old tongue. Bjorn spun from the window, his heart hammering. Those words, Litla Dottir Ulfa, came from the family genealogy his grandfather had made him memorize. Ancient kennings used only by their bloodline, passed down through 27 generations of Eriksens who'd ruled and raided from these very fjords. He knelt beside his daughter, studying her face for any sign of imagination or confusion. He found only truth reflected in eyes the same ice blue as his own. "Freya, this is important. Did Mama say anything before she left?" "She touched my cheek and whispered that she loved us. Then she said something in the old language. It sounded like skuld debt must be paid. Skuld skal betales." The words hit Bjorn like a physical blow. His grandfather had whispered the same phrase on his deathbed, along with warnings about a curse that followed their women, a price demanded by those who died unavenged. Old man's ravings, Bjorn had thought. Superstition from an era when Vikings blamed bad harvests on angry spirits. But Astrid was gone, and the storm that had taken her defied every law of nature he understood. Thunder crashed overhead, not the rolling boom of normal storms, but the rhythmic pounding of what sounded unmistakably like a war drum. In the spaces between beats, other sounds emerged, the clash of metal on metal, voices raised in ancient battle cries, the splash of oars that had no business existing in the sky. Bjorn rose and began pulling on his heaviest coat, his movements automatic despite the chaos in his mind. 30 years of fishing these waters had taught him that when the sea demanded sacrifice, it would keep taking until satisfied. If some ancient debt truly followed his bloodline, running wouldn't save them. "Where are you going?" Freya scrambled from beneath her blanket, eyes wide with the terror of a child who'd already lost one parent tonight. "To bring Mama home." He checked the heavy flashlight clipped to his belt, tested the radio that produced only static, shouldered the coil of rope he always carried in rough weather. "Mrs. Hansen will—" "No." Freya stood, small chin raised in defiance that reminded him painfully of Astrid. "The Shadow Man said the debt was mine to inherit. If you leave me here, he'll come back." The truth of it settled over Bjorn like ice water. Whatever hunted his family wouldn't be satisfied with just Astrid. It would return for Freya, and for any children she might someday bear, until every branch of their bloodline had paid whatever price his ancestors owed. Outside, the storm pulsed with malevolent patience, waiting for his decision. "Then you come with me." The words left Bjorn's mouth before his rational mind could stop them. Every instinct screamed against taking his 8-year-old daughter into a supernatural tempest, but the alternative, leaving her alone for the Shadow Man to claim, was unthinkable. He pulled Freya's thickest sweater over her head, his hands steady despite the chaos in his heart. This was what 30 years on these waters had prepared him for, though he'd never imagined the enemy would be his own bloodline's past. Every morning before dawn, he'd kissed Astrid goodbye and sailed into uncertainty. Every evening, he'd return to the warmth of this cottage, to Freya's laughter echoing off hand-hewn beams, to his wife humming old folk songs while she braided their daughter's hair. "Arms up," he murmured, wrapping Freya in her winter coat, the red one Astrid had sewn with extra pockets for the shells and sea glass Freya collected along the shore. How many times had he watched them walk that beach together, Astrid pointing out the shapes in clouds while Freya chattered about the stories those shapes might tell. His wife moved through their small world like a gentle current, binding their family together with traditions she'd learned from her own mother: Friday fish stew that filled the cottage with warmth, bedtime songs in 3 languages, morning coffee shared in companionable silence while watching the sun paint the fjords gold. The life they'd built here felt suddenly fragile as spun glass. Every ritual, every shared moment, every plan they'd made for Freya's future, all of it balanced on the edge of whatever ancient blade hung over their bloodline. Bjorn secured a wool cap over his daughter's ears, remembering the morning just 3 days ago when she'd burst into their bedroom at dawn, breathless with excitement about the seal pup she'd spotted from her window. Astrid had made hot chocolate while he'd helped Freya focus his father's old binoculars, the 3 of them crowding together at the kitchen window to watch the pup explore the rocks below their cliff. Such ordinary magic, the kind that happened every day in families that weren't haunted by long-dead warriors. "Papa, what if we can't find Mama?" Freya's question cut through his memories like cold wind. He knelt to meet her eyes, seeing not just his daughter, but the continuation of everything he and Astrid had dreamed of. Freya's first day of school, which they'd planned to celebrate with her favorite cloudberry cake. The fishing boat he'd begun building in their shed, sized small enough for her to learn on when she turned 12. The university in Bergen where Astrid insisted their daughter would study, not because fishing wasn't honorable work, but because Freya deserved choices they'd never had. "We will find her," he said, willing certainty into his voice. "The Eriksens have survived for 27 generations by refusing to give up what's ours." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. His grandfather's stories had always carried warnings about the women who'd vanished. Bjorn's great-great-grandmother, who'd walked into a blizzard in 1847 and was never seen again. His great-aunt Ingrid, found 3 days after a spring storm, floating in the harbor with no memory of how she'd gotten there, speaking only in Old Norse until the day she died. The pattern stretched back through family records kept in his grandfather's careful hand, each generation losing at least one woman to something that defied explanation. He'd thought moving to Røst would break that pattern. This isolated village, where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately, had seemed like sanctuary. He'd built them a life of beautiful predictability, mornings checking his nets while Astrid taught Freya mathematics at their kitchen table afternoons when his girls would wave to him from the cliff as he brought his boat home, evenings when Freya practiced violin while Astrid mended clothes and he carved fishing lures by the fire. Even his restlessness, the way his eyes sometimes lingered on ships heading for distant ports, the way his hands would pause over travel magazines in the village store, had seemed manageable compared to the contentment he found in their simple routines. What was wanderlust compared to watching Freya's face light up when she successfully tied a fisherman's knot? What adventure could match the satisfaction of providing for his family through skill and determination rather than luck? Now that contentment felt like willful blindness. He'd been so focused on creating normalcy that he'd ignored the family history written in his grandfather's journals. dismissed the way Astrid sometimes woke from dreams speaking words in languages she claimed not to know. Bjorn stood and shouldered his emergency pack, the one he'd assembled for fishing emergencies, but never thought he'd use for something like this. Outside, the storm's drumbeat grew more insistent, as if sensing his resolve. "Ready?" he asked, taking Freya's mittened hand in his. She nodded, though her grip trembled. Together, they faced the door that separated their warm, ordinary world from whatever waited in the supernatural tempest beyond. Bjorn's hand closed around the iron door handle, the same handle his grandfather had forged in the old style, carved with protective runes that now felt less like decoration and more like desperate prayer. The metal burned cold against his palm, and for a heartbeat he hesitated, knowing that once they crossed this threshold, their quiet life in Røst would become memory. The door swung open, and the storm seized them immediately. Wind struck like a physical blow, driving needles of ice into every exposed inch of skin. Bjorn pulled Freya close, feeling her small body pressed against his side as they stepped into chaos. The world beyond their cottage had transformed into something alien. Snow whirled in patterns that hurt to look at directly, forming spirals within spirals that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. "Papa!" Freya's voice barely reached him over the howling, but her mittened hand pointed toward the cliff path. "There, do you see?" Through the supernatural blizzard, shapes moved with purpose that defied the storm's violence. Tall figures in dark clothing walked unaffected by wind that should have knocked them flat, their movements steady as they descended toward the harbor. Even at this distance, Bjorn could make out the distinctive silhouette of the one in front. Broad shoulders, long braided hair, the glint of metal scales across his chest. The shadow man who had called to Astrid, who had somehow known their family's ancient words. "We follow them," Bjorn said, adjusting his grip on Freya's hand. Every instinct screamed against pursuing armed strangers into a supernatural storm, but the alternative was letting Astrid vanish into whatever otherworldly current had seized her. He'd spent his life reading the moods of dangerous waters, learning when to fight them and when to let them carry him where they needed him to go. This felt like both at once. They stumbled down the familiar path that led from their cottage to the village, but the landscape had become a maze of shadows and swirling snow. Landmarks Bjorn had known since childhood. The distinctive boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the ancient stone marker left by his great-grandfather, appeared and disappeared in the storm like half-remembered dreams. The very ground beneath their feet seemed unstable, shifting between the rocky coastal path he'd walked 1,000 times and something else entirely, something that crunched with the sound of old bones. Freya stumbled, and as Bjorn caught her, the wind carried a sound that made his blood freeze. The deep, resonant note of a horn blown in the old way, calling warriors to gather. It echoed from the direction of the harbor, where no horn should exist, where nothing should exist but the small fishing boats and weather-beaten docks of their modern world. "The shadow man," Freya gasped, pointing through a gap in the storm. "He's not alone anymore." Bjorn followed her gaze and felt reality crack around him. The harbor below had transformed into something from his grandfather's most vivid stories. Where 21st century fishing boats should have been moored, a massive longship rode the impossible waves, its dragon-head prow carved with such fierce detail that it seemed alive in the storm's green lightning. Figures moved across its deck with practiced efficiency, securing ropes and adjusting a sail marked with symbols Bjorn recognized from the family genealogy. The raven banner of his ancestors, the bloodline that had once ruled these waters through strength and terror. And there, being helped aboard by hands both gentle and inexorable, was Astrid. Even at this distance, even through the supernatural chaos, Bjorn could see his wife moving as if in a trance, her pale nightgown whipping in the wind as she stepped onto the deck of the impossible ship. She turned once, looking back toward their cottage with an expression that broke his heart. Love and sorrow and a terrible acceptance, as if she'd always known this moment would come. "Mama!" Freya cried out, her voice lost in the storm. The shadow man, the Draugr, Bjorn's mind finally accepted, stood at Astrid's side, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of ancient authority. He raised his other hand, and his voice carried impossibly over the wind, speaking words in Old Norse that Bjorn's blood remembered even if his conscious mind struggled to translate. The debt of 20 generations comes due. What was taken must be returned. Lightning split the sky, and in that moment of sickly illumination, Bjorn saw the Draugr's face clearly for the first time. The features were weathered by centuries and death, but unmistakable. The same ice-blue eyes that looked back at him from mirrors, the same stubborn jawline that marked every Eriksen for 27 generations. This was family, in the most terrible sense of the word. The longship began to move, cutting through waves that shouldn't exist, carrying Astrid toward a horizon that flickered between the familiar coastline of Norway and something else entirely. A shore shrouded in mist and shadow, where ancient halls waited for the return of the dead. Bjorn faced the choice that would define everything that came after: pursue his wife into whatever otherworldly realm claimed her, or let the curse take another generation of women while he stood helpless on the shore. The answer had never really been in doubt. "Hold tight," he told Freya, and together they began their descent toward the impossible harbor. The path down to the harbor had never felt so treacherous. Each step forward felt like betrayal, not just of common sense, but of every promise he'd made to keep his family safe. Bjorn's boots slipped on stones made treacherous by supernatural ice, and with each stumble, doubt clawed deeper into his chest. What kind of father drags his 8-year-old daughter into this madness? The rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 30 years of dangerous fishing, screamed at him to turn back. Take Freya to the village, find Mrs. Hansen, call the authorities even if they'd think him mad. Astrid was already lost to whatever ancient horror had claimed her. Why sacrifice their daughter too? But when he looked down at Freya's determined face, saw his own stubborn chin reflected in her features, he knew she'd been right. The Draugr would return for her. Tonight, tomorrow, next year, it didn't matter. The debt would demand payment until their bloodline was extinguished completely. "Papa, stop!" Freya's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. She'd planted her feet on the icy path, refusing to take another step. "You're scared." The simple truth of it hit harder than any accusation. "Yes," he admitted, crouching to meet her eyes. "I'm terrified." Below them, the impossible longship grew more distinct with each flash of green lightning. Its crew moved with the fluid efficiency of the dead, no wasted motion, no uncertainty. They knew their purpose with a clarity that made Bjorn's doubt feel like cowardice. These were his ancestors, warriors who'd faced death 1,000 times and won. What did they see in him now? A soft modern man who'd forgotten the old ways, who'd tried to hide from his heritage behind fishing nets and quiet domesticity? "What if I can't protect you?" The question escaped before he could stop it. "What if whatever took Mama is stronger than..." "Then what?" Freya's mittened hands found his face, forcing him to focus on her instead of the growing horror below. "Stronger than the man who teaches me to tie sailors' knots? Stronger than the papa who carries me on his shoulders when I'm tired, who makes faces at me through the kitchen window when he comes home from fishing?" Her faith in him felt like a weight he couldn't bear. Every day for 8 years, he'd been her anchor, her source of certainty in an uncertain world. She'd never seen him fail at anything that mattered. But this, pursuing undead Vikings into otherworldly waters to challenge a curse 20 generations deep, this was beyond anything in his experience. The storm pulsed around them, and in its rhythm, he heard the heartbeat of something vast and patient and utterly alien to the quiet life he'd built. Down in that harbor waited creatures that had conquered half of Europe, that had carved their names into history with blood and iron. What was one modern fisherman against that legacy? "Everything," his grandfather's voice whispered from memory. "You are everything they died to create." Bjorn closed his eyes, remembering the stories that had shaped his childhood. Not just the tales of Viking raids and conquest, but the quieter narratives of sacrifice. Eriksen men who'd sailed into impossible odds to bring their families home. Women who'd faced down storms and starvation to protect what they loved. His bloodline hadn't survived 27 generations through strength alone, but through the stubborn refusal to abandon those who mattered most. The boat, Freya said suddenly, tugging his sleeve. "Papa, look at our boat." Through the supernatural chaos, Bjorn spotted his fishing vessel, Astrid's dream, bobbing at its mooring like a cork in the impossible waves, 30 feet of practical Norwegian engineering built for reliability rather than glory. It looked pathetically small next to the longship, but it was real, familiar, his. "I could get us to the longship," he said slowly, the plan forming even as he spoke. "If we're quick, if the engine holds." But then what? The question he'd been avoiding crashed over him with brutal clarity. Even if they reached the Draugur's vessel, even if by some miracle they got Astrid back, what then? How did you fight the dead? How did you break a curse that had endured for centuries? His hand found the iron pendant his grandfather had given him, a simple hammer, worn smooth by generations of Eriksen men who'd faced the impossible. The metal felt warm against his palm, and for a moment the storm's howling seemed to carry other voices, older voices, speaking words of encouragement in the ancient tongue. "You are not alone," they seemed to whisper. "We are with you, as we have always been." The doubt didn't disappear. If anything, it crystallized into something sharper, more honest. Yes, he was terrified. Yes, this was beyond anything he understood. Yes, he might lose everything tonight. But Astrid was already lost, and Freya would be next if he did nothing. "Hold tight," he said again. And this time his voice carried the iron determination that had built empires. "We're going to get Mama back." The final descent to the harbor felt like stepping through the membrane between worlds. With each footfall, the familiar gave way to the impossible. Cobblestones that should have been worn smooth by generations of fishermen now gleamed with runes that pulsed in rhythm with the storm's heartbeat. The very air grew thick with the salt tang of ancient seas, waters that had carried longships to distant shores centuries before Bjorn's birth. "The moorings," Freya whispered, pointing toward the docks with wonder rather than fear. "They're different." She was right. The modern concrete pier had transformed into something carved from black stone, its posts topped with iron braziers that burned with cold fire. Where his neighbors' boats should have been moored, shadows of ancient vessels flickered in and out of existence, ghost ships from every generation of his bloodline, waiting to ferry the living into waters that existed beyond any map. Astrid's dream rocked at the end of the supernatural dock, impossibly unchanged amid the otherworldly transformation. Her blue-painted hull and practical wheelhouse looked defiantly ordinary, an anchor of the modern world in a harbor that had reverted to its mythic past. Bjorn's grandfather had helped him buy that boat, had taught him to read the subtle signs of weather and current that kept fishermen alive in these treacherous waters. Now it would carry them into dangers no practical knowledge could prepare him for. "Papa!" Freya's grip on his hand tightened as they approached the dock. "The longship, it's waiting." The Draugur vessel had positioned itself just beyond the harbor mouth, close enough that Bjorn could make out individual figures moving across its deck with the patient efficiency of the dead. Astrid stood at the prow, her pale nightgown billowing in wind that seemed to touch only her, as if she'd already begun to exist in a different realm than the one they inhabited. The Shadow Man, his ancestor, his blood, his family's ancient shame made manifest, stood beside her with one hand on the dragon head carving, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the shore where Bjorn and Freya descended toward their fate. "He knows we're coming," Bjorn said, helping Freya across the gangplank to his boat. The familiar deck felt solid beneath their feet, real in a way that made the supernatural harbor seem almost manageable. This was his domain, 30 years of experience reading currents and weather, of coaxing temperamental engines to life in emergencies, of navigating by instinct when instruments failed. Astrid's dream's engine turned over with a rumble that seemed to offend the storm's otherworldly silence. Modern diesel and practical engineering, the tools of a man who'd chosen ordinary life over the violent glory of his ancestors. But as they puttered away from the transformed dock, Bjorn felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that perhaps those two paths weren't as different as he'd believed. Every fishing trip had been its own small voyage into the unknown. Every time he'd read weather signs and decided to risk the open water despite approaching storms, he'd been choosing action over safety, courage over comfort. The skills were the same: reading the environment, adapting to changing conditions, refusing to surrender when the stakes mattered most. "The water," Freya said, leaning over the rail to stare down at waves that reflected stars from no earthly sky. "It's showing me things." Bjorn looked and saw what she meant. The supernatural waters served as a window into other times, images flickering just beneath the surface of Viking raids and distant shores, of his ancestors claiming new lands through will and iron. But deeper still, he glimpsed quieter moments, Eriksen fathers teaching sons to navigate by starlight, mothers singing children to sleep with lullabies older than Christianity, families gathering around fires to share stories that preserved their history across generations of upheaval. The long ship grew larger as they approached, its impossible scale dwarfing their fishing boat. Up close, every detail spoke of otherworldly craftsmanship. The dragon prow carved so perfectly it seemed ready to breathe fire, shields hanging along the gunwales that bore the marks of battles fought in realms beyond the mortal world, rigging that hummed with power drawn from storms and shadow. Astrid turned as they drew near, and Bjorn's heart broke at the expression on her face. Love and sorrow intertwined with a terrible acceptance, as if she'd always known this moment would come. She raised one hand in greeting, but made no move to jump to their boat, no cry for rescue. Whatever hold the Draugr had on her ran deeper than simple enchantment. The Shadow Man stepped forward, his voice carrying impossibly over the storm. "Bjorn Eriksen, son of Erik, grandson of Magnus, heir to 27 generations of those who rule these waters." Each word fell like a hammer blow. "You come to claim what the dead have taken, but are you prepared to pay the price that claiming requires?" Bjorn cut the engine, letting momentum carry them the final distance. Around them, the supernatural storm held its breath, waiting for his answer. Behind them lay the safety of the shore, the possibility of retreat, the chance to preserve what remained of their ordinary life. Ahead waited the unknown, danger and magic in equal measure, the confrontation with family history that he'd spent 42 years avoiding. There was no going back. "I'm prepared," he called across the water, and meant it. The Draugr's laughter rippled across the water like breaking ice. "Words are easy, descendant, but the ancient ways demand proof." He raised his hand, and the longship's crew stepped forward in unison, 8 warriors bearing the unmistakable features of the Eriksen bloodline, their faces bearing wounds that spoke of how each had died. To claim what belongs to the dead, you must first prove yourself worthy of your ancestor's name. The supernatural waters between the boats began to churn, and Bjorn watched in fascination and growing dread as shapes emerged from the depths. Not sea creatures, but remnants of ancient challenges. Floating platforms of black stone carved with runes, connected by chains that gleamed like captured starlight. A testing ground had risen from whatever otherworldly realm these waters touched. 3 trials, the Draugr continued, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic law. Strength, wisdom, and sacrifice. Fail anyone, and your wife joins our crew forever. Your daughter follows when her time comes, as the debt demands. Astrid's voice cut through the storm, the first words she'd spoken since vanishing into the blizzard. "Bjorn, no. The trials, they're designed to break the living. No mortal has passed them for 200 years. But even as she spoke, Freya was tugging at his sleeve with urgent excitement. "Papa, look at the water around us. Look what's coming up." Bjorn followed her gaze and saw them, ghostly figures rising from the depths around their fishing boat. Not Draugr, but something else entirely. Translucent forms that carried themselves with familiar dignity, their faces bearing the weathered nobility of generations spent battling these very waters. His ancestors, but not the ones serving aboard the longship. "The choosers," whispered a voice that sounded like his grandfather's, though the old man had been dead for 15 years. "Every generation has them, Bjorn. Those who chose different paths." A woman's voice joined the ghostly chorus, speaking with his grandmother's accent. "The Draugr shows you only one side of our legacy, the warriors who could not let go, who clung to death rather than embrace whatever comes after. But we are here too." More spirits materialized around Astrid's dream. Eriksen ancestors who had died in their beds, who had chosen love over conquest, who had found peace instead of eternal warfare. Their presence felt different from the cold power emanating from the longship, warmer despite their spectral nature. "You have allies in this," his grandfather's spirit said, becoming solid enough to place a translucent hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "But the trials must be faced alone. That is the ancient law." The first platform had drifted close enough to board. Upon its surface waited a massive warrior bearing an axe that seemed forged from crystallized stormlight, his face a twisted mirror of Bjorn's own features, the Draugr of his great-great-grandfather, Magnus the Bloodhand, who had died in battle rather than return home to his family. "Strength first," called the shadow man from the longship. "Defeat your ancestors' champion. Prove you carry the warrior's heart that built our line." Bjorn looked at the spectral Magnus, then at Freya's trusting face, finally at Astrid standing captive among the Draugr crew. The weight of generations pressed down on him. All those who had faced impossible choices, who had found courage when courage seemed beyond them. "Wait here," he told Freya, but she shook her head with fierce determination. "The ghost grandmother is right. You have to face the trials alone, but I can help in other ways." She pressed something into his palm, his old fishing knife, the one his grandfather had given him 30 years ago. "It's been blessed by all the choosing spirits, Papa. They touched it while you were listening to the Draugr." The blade felt different now, heavier somehow, humming with power that had nothing to do with its steel edge. Around them, the friendly spirits began to sing, not words, but harmonies that spoke of home and hearth, of choosing life over glory, of finding strength in protection rather than conquest. "The trials change based on who faces them," his grandfather's ghost explained as Bjorn prepared to leap to the first platform. "For a raider, they test only battle fury. For a king, they test only dominion. But for a father," the spirit smiled with ancient pride, "for a father, they test everything that matters." Bjorn kissed Freya's forehead, stepped to the rail of his fishing boat, and jumped. The black stone platform felt solid beneath his boots, though energy crackled through its surface like captured lightning. Before him, the spectral Magnus hefted his supernatural axe and spoke with a voice like grinding glaciers. "Show me the warrior's heart, soft descendant. Show me you deserve the blood we spilled to create you." Behind him, Bjorn could hear Freya's voice joining the ghostly chorus, adding her living breath to their song of encouragement. Ahead waited not just his first trial, but the beginning of a confrontation with every choice his bloodline had ever made. The ancient blade hummed in his grip as he faced the shade of his warlike past. The Draugr Magnus struck first, his storm-forged axe whistling through the air with inhuman speed. Bjorn barely managed to dodge, the ancient blade passing so close he felt its supernatural cold burn against his cheek. The platform beneath his feet bucked like a living thing, responding to the violence with ripples of dark energy that threatened to throw him into the churning waters below. "Too slow, descendant," Magnus snarled, pressing his attack. "In my day, hesitation meant death. Hesitation meant your family starved while other men claimed what should have been yours." The accusations hit as hard as the physical assault. Bjorn parried desperately with his grandfather's knife, the blessed steel ringing against the Draugr's supernatural weapon. Each impact sent shockwaves up his arms, reminders that he was fighting something far beyond mortal strength. This wasn't a trial of simple combat. It was a confrontation with the violent heritage he'd spent his life rejecting. "I chose a different path," Bjorn gasped, rolling away from another devastating swing. "I chose peace." Magnus's laughter was like breaking glass. "Peace? You chose comfort. You chose to hide behind fishing nets while the warrior's blood we gave you went to waste." The axe carved through the air again, this time catching Bjorn's sleeve and tearing the fabric like paper. "Your wife is lost because you were too weak to claim the power that was always yours by right." The words found their mark, striking at doubts Bjorn had carried for years. How many times had he wondered if his quiet life was really strength or merely cowardice dressed up as virtue? How many times had he felt the old song stirring something restless in his blood, only to bury it beneath the mundane concerns of modern existence? From Astrid's dream, Freya's voice rose above the storm. You're not weak, Papa. You're the strongest person I know. Her faith steadied him, reminded him of truths Magnus couldn't understand. Bjorn stopped retreating and began to fight with purpose, using the platform's shifting surface to his advantage. Where the Draugr relied on raw power, Bjorn employed the patience of a fisherman who'd learned to read subtle currents, to work with natural forces rather than simply overwhelming them. This is your strength? Magnus sneered, but Bjorn caught something new in the ancient warrior's voice. Uncertainty. Not strength, Bjorn replied, dodging another blow while positioning himself for a counterattack. Adaptation. His knife found the gap between Magnus's spectral armor plates, sliding between ribs that had been broken by the killing blow centuries ago. You fought to conquer. I learned to survive. The Draugr staggered, his form flickering like a candle in wind. Impossible. I am Magnus Bloodhand. I carved my name into history with iron and fury. And where did it lead? Bjorn pressed his advantage, not with violence, but with words that carried the weight of generations. You died alone on a foreign shore while your family wondered if you'd ever return. Your wife raised your children without you. Your legacy was built on absence. Magnus swung again, but his movements had grown clumsy, confused. I gave them security. I brought home gold and glory. You brought home ghosts and guilt. Bjorn stepped inside the Draugr's reach, his blessed blade finding the ancient warrior's heart. I may not have conquered kingdoms, but I kissed my daughter goodnight every evening. I held my wife when storms frightened her. I was present for the life I helped create. The spectral Magnus looked down at the knife in his chest with something like wonder. You would choose smaller glories? I chose the glories that last, Bjorn said gently, understanding now that this trial wasn't about defeating his ancestor, but about healing him. The ones that create rather than destroy. Magnus nodded slowly, his form beginning to dissolve into motes of silver light. Perhaps there is strength in that. His voice grew distant, peaceful. Fight well, descendant, but fight for what truly matters. The first platform crumbled away as soon as the Draugr faded, forcing Bjorn to leap toward the second trial. This platform was smaller, carved with runes that seemed to shift and change even as he watched. At its center stood a figure he recognized from old family portraits, Astrid's great-grandmother, Ingrid the Wise, whose eyes held the terrible clarity of those who had seen too much. Strength of arm is simple, she said, her voice carrying across the supernatural waters. But wisdom requires sacrifice of certainty, the courage to face truths that comfort cannot survive. Behind them, the Shadow Man's voice boomed with approval. The second trial begins. Show us the depth of your understanding, Bjorn Eriksen. Show us you can see clearly even when seeing brings only pain. From his boat, Freya called out with 8-year-old determination. You've got this, Papa, grandmother's ghost told me. The answer isn't what you think. The platform beneath his feet began to glow, and suddenly Bjorn's mind filled with visions of his family's past. Not the glorified tales of Viking conquest, but the complex truth of choices made and prices paid across 27 generations. The wisdom trial had begun. The visions crashed over Bjorn like a tide of molten truth, each image searing itself into his consciousness with devastating clarity. He saw the real history of the Eriksen line, not the sanitized legends he'd grown up with, but the brutal accounting of every choice, every sacrifice, every moment when love had collided with duty across 27 generations. There was his ancestor Erik the Red-Handed, standing over the body of his own brother, killed in a dispute over inheritance that would fund raids to feed their starving village. The horror in Erik's eyes as he realized what ambition had cost him, even as he picked up the bloodied silver and continued with his plans. Another vision, great-grandmother Solveig, who had watched her husband sail away to war and deliberately walked into the winter sea rather than face another season of wondering if he would return. Her children had found her frozen body at dawn, clutching a letter that simply read, I choose the certainty of ending over the agony of hoping. Do you see? Ingrid's voice cut through the cascade of painful memories. Do you understand the weight of what you carry? Each generation believed they were choosing the lesser evil, the necessary sacrifice, Each one told themselves their pain would purchase peace for their children. The visions intensified. Bjorn watched his own grandfather Erik, the gentle man who had taught him to fish, who had sung lullabies in Old Norse, standing in a Nazi uniform during the occupation, his face hollow with self-hatred as he fed information to the resistance. The terrible mathematics of survival, betray his neighbors or watch his family starve. The sleepless nights afterward, the bottles of aquavit that never quite drowned the memory of choices that had no right answers. Bjorn gasped, his knees hitting the stone platform as the weight of generational trauma threatened to crush him. He was a good man. He saved people. He was human, Ingrid said, her voice carrying infinite compassion and infinite sorrow. They all were. Every Eriksen who ever lived, caught between impossible choices, trying to protect what they loved while carrying the burden of what protection cost. Her form shimmered, becoming translucent enough that he could see through her to even more visions. Endless cycles of violence and sacrifice stretching back to the very beginning of their bloodline. The most devastating vision came last, Astrid, just 3 nights ago, standing in their kitchen after Freya had gone to bed. She was holding an old letter, her face wet with tears Bjorn had been too tired to notice. In the vision he watched her read words written in her great-grandmother's hand, "The debt comes due in the 4th generation. When the storm calls she must answer, or it will take them all, husband, daughter, and all who come after." Astrid had known. She had walked into that blizzard not as a victim of supernatural compulsion, but as a woman making the same impossible choice that had haunted their families for centuries, sacrifice herself to protect those she loved. "The wisdom trial," Ingrid said, her voice growing distant as the visions began to fade, "is not about knowing the truth. It is about accepting what you do with truth once you possess it." She gestured toward the 3rd and final platform, where a figure Bjorn recognized as his own father waited, but not his father as he had known him, rather his father as he might have been if he had lived to face his own impossible choice. "You see the pattern now," Ingrid continued. "You understand that every generation has faced this moment, the call to pay a blood debt that stretches back to our people's violent origins. The question is not whether you can break the cycle. The question is whether you can transform it." From the longship, the Shadow Man's voice carried approval and something else, anticipation. He sees clearly now, but seeing and acting are different things. The final trial awaits, the test of sacrifice. Bjorn rose unsteadily to his feet, the blessed knife still humming in his grip. The wisdom he had gained felt like a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders with the accumulated sorrow of 27 generations. But beneath the weight, something else stirred. Not the berserker rage of his warrior ancestors, but something quieter and infinitely more dangerous. Understanding. He looked back at Freya, still singing with the helpful spirits around their fishing boat, her young voice adding brightness to their ancient harmonies. She was the 28th generation, the one who would inherit whatever choice he made on that final platform. She was also the first Eriksen child in centuries who had been raised with complete honesty about her heritage, the first who might face her own trials without the devastating shock of hidden truths. The pattern could be broken, but only if he was willing to pay a price that would make all previous sacrifices seem small by comparison. "I understand," he called to Ingrid as her form began to dissolve. "I see what must be done." Her smile carried the weight of ages. "Then you are ready for the final test." The 3rd platform beckoned, and with it, the confrontation that would determine not just Astrid's fate, but the destiny of every Eriksen yet to be born. Bjorn leaped toward the final platform, his boots striking stone that felt warm beneath his feet, too warm, as if heated by the accumulated blood of generations. The figure waiting for him made his breath catch in his throat. It was his father, Olaf, but not as Bjorn remembered him from childhood. This version stood tall and strong, unmarked by the cancer that had eaten him alive when Bjorn was 16, his eyes holding the terrible wisdom of choices unmade. "My son," Olaf said, his voice carrying both love and inexorable judgment, "you have seen our history. You understand the weight of our blood. Now comes the moment that defines all moments. What are you willing to sacrifice to save them? The platform began to change beneath Bjorn's feet, the stone flowing like liquid until it formed a perfect circle divided by a deep channel that glowed with supernatural fire. On one side of the divide stood Astrid, no longer among the Draugr crew but bound by chains of what looked like crystallized starlight. On the other side, Freya appeared. Not the real Freya, who was still singing safely on their boat, but a perfect replica that looked at him with his daughter's trusting eyes. The final choice, his father continued, gesturing to the two figures. Save your wife, and your daughter will be claimed when she comes of age. The debt passed forward as it always has been. Save your daughter's future, and Astrid remains lost forever, her sacrifice sealing the curse for all time. Bjorn's mind reeled. This was the test that had broken every previous generation, the impossible mathematics of love, where any choice led to unbearable loss. He looked from Astrid to the image of Freya, understanding now why his ancestors had always failed. How could any parent choose between wife and child? How could any husband weigh present love against future protection? There has to be another way, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. Olaf shook his head sadly. 27 generations have stood where you stand now, son. 27 generations have looked for the third path that doesn't exist. The debt must be paid. The only choice is who pays it. Behind him, the Shadow Man's voice boomed with ancient authority. Choose, Eriksen. The storm grows tired of waiting. Choose, or we take them both. Bjorn looked at the blessed knife in his hand, then at his father's expectant face. A terrible understanding began to dawn. The weapon hadn't been blessed by his ancestors to help him fight them. It had been blessed for an entirely different purpose. There is a third path, he whispered, the words coming as if from somewhere outside himself. Not wife or daughter. Not passing the debt forward or accepting eternal loss. What are you saying? Olaf asked, but something in his ghostly features suggested he already knew. Bjorn raised the knife, its point hovering over his own heart. The debt demands Eriksen blood. It doesn't specify which Eriksen must pay. He looked back at the real Freya on their boat, her song faltering as she sensed what he was contemplating. If I pay it myself, if I take my own life with this blessed blade, the debt dies with me. No more generations trapped in this cycle, no more impossible choices. The platform shuddered beneath his feet. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the Shadow Man's voice carried uncertainty. That is not how the trials work, mortal. That is not what the blood debt demands. Isn't it? Bjorn pressed the knife's point against his chest, feeling the blessed steel warm against his skin. For 27 generations, we've accepted your rules, your definitions of choice and sacrifice. But what if the real trial was always simpler? What if it was just about being willing to end the cycle, even if it cost everything? From the longship came the sound of Draugr stirring uneasily, their ancient certainties challenged by a possibility none had considered. Astrid's voice cut through the supernatural wind, sharp with terror. Bjorn, no! There has to be another way! But even as she spoke, the chains binding her began to loosen, responding to his willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. The image of Freya smiled sadly and began to fade, as if his choice had already broken whatever magic held it together. If you do this, his father warned, there is no return, no second chances. You will be gone forever. Bjorn thought of Freya's laughter, of Astrid's gentle breathing beside him on cold nights, of all the small, perfect moments that made up a life worth living. Then he thought of his daughter growing up free from ancient curses, able to choose her own path without the weight of generational debt crushing her spirit. Some prices are worth paying, he said, and drove the blessed blade toward his heart. But in that final instant, as steel met flesh, something went terribly wrong. The knife shattered against an invisible barrier, its blessed fragments scattering into the storm. The platform cracked beneath his feet, and with a sound like the world breaking, everything began to collapse. He had failed. The trial had rejected his sacrifice, and now there would be no choice at all. The sound of shattering steel echoed across the supernatural waters, but in that moment of apparent failure, something extraordinary happened. The fragments of the blessed blade hung suspended in the air like falling stars, each piece glowing with its own inner light. And in their luminescence, Bjorn saw the truth that had eluded 27 generations of his bloodline. The knife hadn't shattered because his sacrifice was rejected. It had shattered because sacrifice was never the answer. "You fool!" the Shadow Man's voice boomed, but there was something different in it now. Something that sounded almost like relief? "Did you truly think we wanted more death? More blood to feed an endless cycle?" The collapsing platform steadied beneath Bjorn's feet as understanding crashed over him. He looked up at the figure he had assumed was the architect of his family's suffering, seeing it clearly for the first time. The shadows fell away, revealing not some ancient enemy, but a draugr wearing the weathered face of the very first Erik, his ancestor, the one who had supposedly started this blood debt centuries ago. "The curse," Bjorn whispered, his voice filled with dawning comprehension. It was never about paying a debt, it was about learning to refuse payment. The first Erik nodded, his spectral features heavy with exhaustion that spanned centuries. "Each generation, we hoped. Each generation, we watched our descendants accept the premise that blood must answer for blood, that sacrifice was noble, that someone had to pay." His voice carried infinite sorrow. But the real curse was never supernatural. It was the belief that suffering could be traded like currency, that love could be measured in loss. Around them, the draugr crew of the longship began to change. The rot fell away from their forms, revealing them not as monsters but as ancestors. Generation after generation of Eriksens who had been trapped not by magic, but by their own acceptance of false choices. They had become the very cycle they sought to break, perpetuating it with every trial, every test, every demand for sacrifice. Astrid knew, Bjorn said, understanding flooding through him like a tide. When she walked into the storm, she wasn't accepting the curse, she was challenging it. His father, Olaf, stepped forward, his ghostly form now radiant with pride rather than sorrow. "Your wife refused to choose between you and Freya. She walked into the storm not to sacrifice herself, but to find us, to demand we face what we had become." He gestured toward where Astrid stood, her starlight chains dissolving like morning frost. She spent 3 days arguing with 27 generations of stubborn Eriksen men, trying to make us see that we had created our own prison. Astrid stepped toward him across the now solid platform, tears streaming down her face. They were so convinced that honor required suffering, that strength meant carrying impossible burdens. It took Freya's voice to finally reach them, a child who could see past their ancient pride to the simple truth. From their fishing boat, the real Freya's laughter rang out across the supernatural waters. "I told them they were being silly, Papa. Grandmother's ghost was right there helping me the whole time. All the lady ancestors were tired of watching their men make everything so complicated." The longship dissolved like mist, taking with it the trials, the platforms, the entire architecture of tests that had trapped his family for centuries. In its place, the storm began to calm, revealing a sight that took Bjorn's breath away. Dozens of spirits stood on the suddenly peaceful waters, not just the Eriksen men who had perpetuated the cycle, but their wives, daughters, mothers, and sisters who had watched helplessly as their loved ones chose honor over happiness, duty over presence, sacrifice over the simple courage to be alive and present for each other. "The blood debt," Bjorn said, finally grasping the full scope of the revelation, "was never real. We created it ourselves. Guilt passed down like a family heirloom, each generation convinced they had to atone for the violence of those who came before." The first Erik began to fade, but his expression was peaceful now, no longer bearing the weight of centuries. "The debt is forgiven, descendant, not because it has been paid, but because we finally remember it never existed at all. We were Vikings, yes. We raided and fought and took what we needed to survive. But we were also fathers and husbands and sons who loved our families. The guilt was never ours to carry." As the last of the supernatural storm dissipated, Bjorn found himself standing on solid ground. A small island he recognized from childhood fishing trips, just a few hundred yards from their cottage. The northern lights danced overhead in their natural glory, no longer twisted by ancient grief into unnatural tempests. Astrid took his hand, solid and warm and absolutely real. The curse is broken, my love. Not by sacrifice, but by refusing to believe sacrifice was ever necessary. Freya's boat bumped against the island shore, his daughter beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had known the answer all along. Can we go home now? I'm getting hungry, and all this ghost talking is hard work. For the first time in 3 days, Bjorn laughed, a sound of pure joy that carried across the water like a blessing. The sound of Bjorn's laughter seemed to crack something fundamental in the world around them. As the echo faded across the water, he felt the weight that had pressed down on his shoulders for 3 days, no, for his entire life, lift like morning fog. The island beneath his feet felt solid and real, anchored in the present rather than drifting through some supernatural realm between worlds. Home, he repeated, the word tasting different now, cleaner, free from the bitter aftertaste of inherited guilt that had seasoned every moment of his life until now. He looked at his hands, calloused from honest work, scarred from fishing nets and boat repairs, but no longer stained with the imagined blood of ancestors he had never met. Astrid squeezed his fingers, and he marveled at how present she felt, not like someone rescued from death or supernatural bondage, but like someone who had simply returned from a difficult conversation that had lasted 3 days too long. The cottage will still need repairs from the storm damage, she said practically, though her eyes danced with their own northern lights. And I suspect we'll have to explain to the village why we disappeared during the worst blizzard in decades. Let them gossip, Bjorn said, surprising himself with how little he cared about the opinions that had once shaped so much of his behavior. Old Lars probably told everyone I went mad with grief and took the boat out in a storm. They'll be relieved to discover it was only temporarily mad. Freya had already climbed out of her boat and was exploring the small island with the fearless curiosity of childhood restored. She picked up smooth stones and examined them with scientific interest, as if testing whether they too might hold ancient secrets. Finding them satisfyingly ordinary, she skipped one across the calm water with expert precision. "Papa," she called, "the lady spirits said something before they left. They wanted me to tell you about the chest." Bjorn frowned. "What chest?" "Under the floorboards in our house. Grandmother Ingrid's grandmother hid it there when she was little, before she forgot she could see spirits." Freya selected another skipping stone with careful deliberation. "It has letters and drawings and things, stories about the family that aren't scary." Astrid's eyes widened with understanding. The real history, not the myths and curses, but the actual lives they lived. She looked at Bjorn with growing excitement. Freya could grow up knowing her ancestors as people, not as cautionary tales or sources of inherited shame. The thought sent a strange thrill through Bjorn's chest. For the first time in his adult life, the past felt like something to explore rather than something to escape. His great-great-grandfather Erik might have been a Viking raider, but what had he been like when he came home? Did he carve toys for his children? Did he sing old songs while mending nets? Had he ever stood on a beach like this one, watching the lights dance overhead and feeling grateful simply to be alive? "We'll read them together," he decided. "All of us. No more family secrets, no more protecting each other from difficult truths." He looked at Freya, whose matter-of-fact acceptance of spirits and magic had ultimately saved them all. "And if there are more supernatural visitors in our future, we'll handle them the way you did, with common sense instead of ancient drama." The boats rocked gently in the calm water, ready to carry them home, but before they left, Bjorn found himself looking back at where the longship had been, where 27 generations of his ancestors had finally found peace. The water was empty now, reflecting only stars and the soft green glow of the aurora, but he felt their presence differently, not as demanding judges or sources of obligation, but as family. Flawed, complicated, human family, who had loved their children enough to perpetuate a cycle they didn't know how to break, until someone finally asked the right questions. "Thank you," he said quietly to the empty air, "for everything you carried so we didn't have to. Rest now." The wind that answered felt like a gentle hand on his shoulder, blessing rather than burden. Astrid was already preparing their small boat for the journey home, her movements sure and practiced. She had always been the practical one, the one who solved problems instead of being paralyzed by them. 3 days in a supernatural storm hadn't changed that. It had only proven what Bjorn had always known, that she was stronger than any curse, older than any debt, more real than any ghost. "The cottage will be cold," she warned as they settled into the boat. "The fire's been out for days, and there's probably ice on everything." "We'll build a new fire," Bjorn said, taking the oars. "A big one. We'll warm the whole house and make tea and tell Freya proper bedtime stories, the kind with happy endings." As they rowed toward home, Freya trailing her hand in the water, Bjorn felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the simple, uncomplicated joy of being exactly where he belonged, with exactly the people he loved, carrying exactly the burdens he had chosen for himself. The northern lights danced overhead, and for once, they were just beautiful. The journey home should have felt triumphant, but as their boat cut through the calm waters toward Røst's familiar harbor, Bjorn found himself wrestling with an unexpected emotion, doubt. Not about the curse, that was broken, finished, done, but about what came next. 3 days ago, he had been a man defined by the weight of inherited guilt, shaped by the constant awareness that his bloodline carried darkness. Every choice he made had been filtered through the lens of ancestral sins, every moment of happiness shadowed by the certainty that payment would eventually come due. Now, rowing through water that reflected nothing but honest starlight, he felt unmoored in a different way. Who was Bjorn Eriksen without a curse to carry? "You're thinking too hard," Astrid observed from the bow, her voice carrying the gentle teasing he had missed more than breathing. "I can practically hear the gears grinding from here." Freya giggled from her position between them, still trailing her fingers in the water, as if testing its reality. "Papa always thinks too hard. Mama says his brain is like old Lars's fishing net, catches everything, even the things he should throw back." Despite his brooding, Bjorn smiled. This was what he had almost lost, not just their lives, but these small moments of family intimacy, the comfortable rhythms of people who knew each other's patterns and loved them anyway. "Your mother is very wise," he admitted, "and very impatient with men who complicate simple things." "Someone has to be," Astrid replied, but her tone was fond. She pointed ahead where the lights of their village sparkled against the dark coastline. "Look, we're almost home." As they drew closer to shore, Bjorn could see signs of the supernatural storm's passage. Boats had been dragged far up the beach, their hulls scarred by ice and wind. Several cottage roofs showed damaged thatch, and debris littered the harbor like the remnants of some great battle. But underneath the destruction, life persisted. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lanterns glowed in windows. The village endured, as it always had. "People will ask questions," he said, pulling harder on the oars as they approached the dock. "About where we went, what happened, why we disappeared in the middle of the worst storm anyone can remember." Freya sat up straighter, considering this with the seriousness she brought to all problems requiring solutions. "We could tell them we found shelter on Grandmother's Island and waited for the storm to pass," she suggested. "That's not even lying." "We did find shelter, just not the regular kind." Astrid nodded approvingly. "Simple truths are always best. Let them assume what they want about the details." But as their boat scraped against the wooden dock, Bjorn realized his anxiety about village gossip was just surface noise masking a deeper concern. The broken curse hadn't just freed his family from supernatural obligations, it had shattered his fundamental understanding of himself. For 42 years he had been the descendant of Vikings, carrier of ancient guilt, guardian against inherited darkness. Strip all that away, and what remained? Bjorn. Astrid's voice was soft but firm, cutting through his spiraling thoughts. She had climbed onto the dock and was extending her hand to help him up. "Whatever you're wrestling with in that complicated head of yours, it can wait until we're warm and dry and fed. Some problems are easier to solve when you're not exhausted and hungry." He took her hand, letting her pull him up onto solid ground. The dock felt strange beneath his feet, too stable, too ordinary after 3 days of supernatural platforms and spectral longships. But Freya was already racing ahead toward their cottage, her excitement infectious as she called back to them about finding the hidden chest and building the biggest fire in the history of fires. "She's right, you know," Astrid said, as they followed their daughter's enthusiastic progress up the path. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight. We don't have to become entirely new people just because an old burden has been lifted. Don't we?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, revealing the fear he hadn't wanted to name. What if the curse was holding more than just guilt? What if it was holding me together? What if without it I'm just— He gestured helplessly at himself. "Nothing in particular." Astrid stopped walking and turned to face him fully, her expression mixing exasperation with fierce love. "Bjorn Eriksen, you are the most stubborn, overthinking, magnificently loyal man I have ever met. You spent 3 days fighting supernatural forces to save your family, not because some curse compelled you, but because that's who you are." She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "The curse didn't make you brave or devoted or willing to sacrifice everything for the people you love. It just made you feel guilty about it." Ahead of them, Freya had reached their cottage and was already calling about the door being unlocked and the fire being almost ready to restart. The normalcy of her voice, bright with anticipation of warmth and safety, cut through Bjorn's existential crisis like a blade through fog. He was a fisherman, a husband, a father, a man who built fires and mended nets and told bedtime stories and worried about his daughter's future. The curse had never defined him. It had only convinced him he needed defining. "Come on," he said, taking Astrid's hand. "Let's go home." But as they approached the cottage door, something felt wrong. The warmth Freya had mentioned wasn't coming from within. It was radiating from the structure itself, as if the very walls pulsed with unnatural heat. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing not the cold darkness they expected, but a faint, shifting light that reminded Bjorn uncomfortably of the aurora's glow. "Papa!" Freya's voice had lost its excitement, replaced by the careful wariness she'd developed over the past 3 days. The fire wasn't already lit. "There's someone inside." Astrid's hand tightened in his. "But the curse is broken. The spirits are at rest." "What could—" "Not all of them." The voice came from inside the cottage, ancient and familiar yet wrong in ways that made Bjorn's skin crawl. "Not the first. Not the one who began it all." Through the crack in the door a shadow moved, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable silhouette of a Viking warrior. But this wasn't the peaceful specter of his father or the resigned acceptance of his ancestor Erik. This presence thrummed with the fury of the truly damned, the rage of someone who had watched centuries of careful work unravel in a single conversation. "Impossible," Bjorn breathed. "We faced the original Erik. He found peace. The debt was mine to collect." The door slammed open, revealing a figure that wore Erik the Red's face but bore none of his newfound wisdom. This was Erik as he had been in the beginning, violent, proud, consumed by the need to justify his actions through an endless chain of consequences. 27 generations I built this legacy, 27 generations of strength forged in suffering. And you think 3 days of sentiment can unmake it all?" Freya pressed against Bjorn's side, but her voice remained steady. "You're not him. The real Erik went to rest with the others. You're just the angry part he left behind." The false Erik's laughter was like breaking ice. "Clever child. Yes, I am what remains when honor is abandoned, when the hard truths are dismissed as ancient drama." He stepped out of the cottage, and Bjorn saw that this specter bore wounds that never healed, the marks of every raid, every battle, every moment of violence that the original Erik had spent eternity trying to justify. "I am the shadow cast by deeds that demand consequence." Everything Bjorn had learned over the past 3 days crystallized into sudden understanding. This wasn't another test or trial. This was the final reckoning with the part of themselves they had tried to break free from. The curse might be lifted, but the choices that created it still echoed through time, demanding acknowledgement. "You're not real," Astrid said firmly. "You're just guilt wearing a familiar face, trying to convince us we still owe something to the past." "Am I?" The shadow Erik drew closer, and with each step the temperature around them plummeted. Look at him. He pointed at Bjorn with a spectral blade. Even now, free from obligation, he doubts himself. Without the weight of ancestral purpose, he fears he is nothing. Deep down, he knows that men like us need something greater than ourselves to serve, or we become nothing but fishermen waiting to die. The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. For 3 days, Bjorn had been driven by the need to save his family, to break the curse, to prove himself worthy of redemption. Now, standing before his cottage with no supernatural crisis to solve, no ancient debt to challenge, he felt the seductive pull of the shadow's argument. What was he without something greater to fight against? But then Freya's small hand slipped into his, warm and absolutely real, and he remembered something crucial. He had never needed to prove himself worthy of love. He had always been loved. Curse or no curse, Viking blood or no Viking blood, heroic quest or no heroic quest. "You're right about one thing," Bjorn said to the shadow Erik, his voice gaining strength. "Men like you need something greater than themselves to serve, but I'm not like you anymore." He squeezed Freya's hand, drew Astrid closer. "I found something greater than revenge or honor or even redemption. I found something worth living for instead of dying for." The shadow flickered, its form wavering like heat distortion. Pretty words. But when the mundane weight of ordinary life settles on your shoulders, when the excitement of crisis fades into the tedium of survival, you'll remember what you've lost. "The curse gave your existence meaning." "No," Bjorn replied with absolute certainty. "The curse gave my existence purpose. Meaning is something entirely different." He stepped forward, not to fight the shadow but to walk through it, choosing his family over his fear, his present over his past. The specter dissolved like morning mist, taking with it the last echo of inherited guilt. The cottage door opened to reveal nothing but cold ashes and the promise of a fire soon to be built. The real test had never been about fighting monsters or breaking curses. It had been about choosing love over legacy, presence over purpose, the small daily courage of building a life instead of serving a destiny. But as the shadow dissolved, the air around them began to thicken and writhe, as if reality itself rejected Bjorn's quiet defiance. The cottage that had promised warmth and safety twisted before their eyes, its familiar walls stretching upward into impossible angles, while the very ground beneath their feet cracked with lines of sickly green light. "You think it ends with pretty words and family sentiment?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, no longer confined to the false Erik's form but spreading through the air like poison. "You think 27 generations of blood and honor dissolve because a fisherman chooses comfort over duty?" The cottage door slammed shut, then opened again to reveal not their humble home, but a vast hall lined with shields and weapons, the mead hall of Erik's original longhouse, where the first blood debt had been sworn. Spectral warriors filled the benches, their eyes burning with the same hungry light that had driven them across dark seas to raid and pillage. These weren't the peaceful spirits Bjorn had helped lay to rest. These were the parts of those men that had never wanted peace, that had fed on violence and conflict, until it became their only sustenance. "Every choice has consequences," the voice continued, taking shape again but larger now, more terrible. Erik, the Red, as legend had painted him, as nightmare had preserved him. "Every debt demands payment. You cannot simply walk away from what you are." Freya pressed closer to Bjorn, but her voice cut through the supernatural storm with startling clarity. "Yes, he can. We all can. That's what being alive means, choosing what we become instead of staying what we were." The spectral warriors rose from their benches with a sound like breaking waves, their weapons gleaming with otherworldly malice. But as they moved toward Bjorn's family, something extraordinary happened. They began to fade, their forms becoming translucent, their weapons dissolving like sea foam. "No," the monstrous Erik roared, his voice cracking with desperation. "The old ways demand respect. Honor requires—" "Nothing," Astrid interrupted, stepping forward with the same practical determination she brought to every problem. "Honor requires nothing, because honor is something we choose to give, not something that can be taken or demanded." She looked directly at the towering specter, utterly unimpressed by its supernatural fury. "You're not even a ghost anymore. You're just an idea that refuses to die, the idea that we owe something to the worst parts of ourselves. The mead hall wavered, its solid walls flickering between vision and reality. Through the cracks, Bjorn could see their actual cottage, small, humble, home. The gap between worlds was closing, the supernatural storm finally running out of power to sustain itself. But the false Erik made one final, desperate attempt to maintain his hold. With a roar of rage that shook the timbers of his crumbling hall, he lunged directly at Freya, spectral blade raised to strike, not to kill, but to mark, to ensure that even if this generation escaped, the next would carry the scar of his passing. In that moment, Bjorn discovered what he truly was beneath all the ancestral weight and inherited guilt. Not a Viking warrior seeking glorious death, not a cursed descendant bound to ancient patterns, but something simpler and infinitely more powerful, a father protecting his child. He didn't draw a weapon or call upon supernatural aid. He simply stepped between the blade and his daughter, wrapping her in his arms and turning his back to the strike, offering his own body as an absolute barrier between the past and her future. The spectral blade struck and shattered. Not against Bjorn's flesh, but against something far stronger, the unshakable reality of a parent's love. The false Erik screamed as his weapon dissolved, the sound growing fainter and more distant until it was nothing but wind through empty halls. The mead hall collapsed like a house of cards, its supernatural architecture unable to compete with the simple, solid truth of a family choosing each other over everything else. The ground stopped cracking. The air cleared, and they stood once again before their cottage. Ordinary, welcoming, real. "It's over," Freya said with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "He's really gone now, all of him." Bjorn straightened slowly, looking around at the peaceful night. The aurora danced overhead, beautiful and natural. The cottage door stood open, revealing nothing more threatening than cold ashes waiting for kindling. Their village sparkled below them, full of neighbors who would ask reasonable questions and accept reasonable answers. "How do you know?" he asked his daughter. Freya pointed to the cottage doorway, where the faintest outline of a familiar figure stood. Erik the Red, as Bjorn had last seen him, whole and peaceful, no longer divided against himself. The ancient Viking raised his hand in a gesture that was part farewell, part blessing, and entirely free of demand or obligation. Then he was gone, taking with him the last echo of supernatural debt. The real confrontation had never been with ghosts or curses or ancient Vikings demanding blood. It had been with the part of himself that believed he needed to be more than human to deserve love. The cottage door clicked shut behind them with a sound so ordinary, so beautifully mundane, that Astrid actually laughed, a bright, startled sound that broke the reverent silence they'd been carrying like a held breath. "Well," she said, hanging her wet coat on its familiar peg, "I suppose we should build that fire Freya's been promising us." But as they moved through the simple motions of homecoming, lighting kindling, hanging wet clothes, checking that the storm shutters were properly latched, Bjorn felt something fundamental shifting inside him, not breaking or healing, but settling, like stones finding their natural place after an earthquake. "Papa," Freya said quietly, crouched beside the growing fire. "You're different now." He paused in the act of pulling dry clothes from their chest, struck by his daughter's perception. "Different how?" She tilted her head, studying him with those two wise eyes that had seen far more than any 8-year-old should. "Smaller," she said finally, "but in a good way, like you don't have to carry so much anymore." The truth of it hit him with unexpected force. For 42 years he had moved through the world bearing the weight of inherited purpose, convinced that his worth lay in serving something greater than himself. First the fishing that fed his family, then the ancestral debt that had defined his bloodline. Even his love for Astrid and Freya had been filtered through that sense of obligation, as if he needed to earn their devotion through constant vigilance against the darkness he believed he carried. Now, watching his wife coax the fire to full life while his daughter arranged their wet boots in a neat row, he realized what he had truly sacrificed in breaking the curse. Not his strength or his purpose or his identity as a protector. He had sacrificed his need to be necessary. "I won't be the same man I was," he said, the words emerging slowly as he tested their weight. The one who fought supernatural storms and broke ancient curses. That version of me. He's gone. Astrid looked up from the fire, her face painted golden by the flames. Good, she said, with characteristic directness. That man was exhausting. He never sat still long enough to enjoy what he was protecting. But what if... He stopped, recognizing the old pattern of catastrophic thinking that had driven him through 3 days of supernatural crisis. What if he became complacent without the curse to guard against? What if ordinary life wasn't enough to hold his restless spirit? What if? Bjorn. Freya's voice carried the same practical authority her mother wielded so effortlessly. You're doing it again, making simple things complicated. She stood and took his hand, her small fingers warm from tending the fire. You want to know what you'll be now that you're not a cursed Viking descendant? He nodded, afraid to trust his voice. You'll be my papa who tells stories and mends nets and burns the fish sometimes when he gets distracted. Her smile was radiant with absolute certainty. You'll be Mama's husband who brings her tea in the morning and argues with her about the weather. You'll be Bjorn from Røst who helps his neighbors and worries too much and loves us more than anything in all the 9 worlds. The simplicity of it was staggering. All his life, he had been reaching for something greater than the man his family already loved. The man who had always been enough, curse or no curse. Heroic destiny or no heroic destiny. That's it? He asked, his voice rough with wonder. That's who I am without all the weight? That's who you've always been, Astrid said, rising to wrap her arms around him. The rest was just noise. Very dramatic, very complicated noise that nearly got us all killed. Outside their cottage windows, the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, not supernatural summons or otherworldly portents, but simply the beautiful natural phenomenon that had danced above these fjords long before Vikings sailed them, and would continue long after the last saga was forgotten. Bjorn pulled his family close, feeling the last vestiges of inherited obligation drain away like water from a broken vessel. In its place grew something infinitely more precious, the quiet certainty that this small life they had built together, this warm cottage, this crackling fire, this daughter who saw too much, and this wife who loved too fiercely, was not a consolation prize for failing to achieve something greater. It was the greatest thing itself. The price of victory had been the version of himself that believed love had to be earned through suffering, that meaning required supernatural purpose, that a man's worth was measured by the weight of his burdens rather than the warmth of his hearth. It was, he realized with profound relief, a sacrifice he was grateful to make, the resolution. For a long moment, they simply held each other before the crackling fire, letting the profound ordinariness of the moment wash over them like a blessing. Bjorn could feel his heartbeat slowing to match the gentle rhythm of Astrid's breathing, could hear Freya humming an old lullaby under her breath, small, human sounds that seemed impossibly precious after 3 days of supernatural storms and otherworldly voices. I'm hungry, Freya announced suddenly, breaking the reverent silence with 8-year-old practicality, and thirsty. And I think I need to change clothes because mine smell like ghost. Astrid laughed, the sound bright and normal and wonderful. Ghost isn't actually a smell, little one. But yes, you definitely need dry things. She moved toward their bedroom to gather fresh clothes, pausing to touch Bjorn's shoulder. You too. You look like you've been wrestling with ancient spirits. Have been, he replied, surprised to find himself smiling. Wouldn't recommend it. As his family bustled around the cottage, Astrid laying out clean clothes, Freya rummaging through their small pantry for something that might constitute a midnight meal, Bjorn found himself noticing details he had overlooked for years, the way the firelight caught the worn grain of their table, polished smooth by countless family dinners. The collection of Freya's small treasures lined up on the windowsill, smooth stones, interesting shells, a piece of driftwood that looked almost like a seal, the pile of his fishing nets in the corner, waiting for tomorrow's mundane repairs. 3 days ago, these things had seemed like the backdrop to his real life, the stage dressing for whatever greater drama was unfolding around him. Now he understood that this was his real life. Everything else had been the distraction. "Papa?" Freya appeared at his elbow, holding a piece of bread and cheese that looked like it had been assembled by enthusiastic but inexperienced hands. "Are you sad that the adventure is over?" The question caught him off guard. Was he? For 42 years, some part of him had been waiting for this. The call to something greater, the chance to prove himself worthy of his bloodline, the opportunity to transform from ordinary fisherman into legendary hero. He had gotten exactly what that restless part of him had always wanted, and he had discovered that what he wanted and what he needed were entirely different things. "No," he said, accepting the lopsided sandwich with appropriate solemnity. "I'm relieved it's over. I'm glad we all came through it safely, and I'm grateful to be home." "Even though you were really brave and saved everyone and broke an ancient curse?" Freya pressed, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Even though you'll probably never do anything that exciting again?" Bjorn considered this seriously, taking a bite of bread and cheese that tasted better than any feast in Valhalla could have. Outside, he could hear the ordinary sounds of their village settling into sleep, shutters closing, dogs barking their nighttime warnings, the distant sound of someone chopping wood for their morning fire. Tomorrow, these same neighbors would ask where they had been during the storm, and he would tell them they had waited it out safely in their cottage. It would even be true in the way that mattered most. "Freya," he said finally, 3 days ago, I thought being brave meant facing down monsters and breaking curses and proving I was worthy of some grand destiny. But you know what the bravest thing I've ever done was?" She shook her head, leaning forward with the intense focus she brought to her favorite stories. "Asking your mother to marry me," he said, reaching out to smooth a tangle from her hair. "I was terrified she'd say no. Terrified I wasn't good enough for someone so smart and strong and beautiful. But I asked anyway because sometimes the scariest thing you can do is hope for something wonderful." Astrid emerged from the bedroom with an armful of dry clothes, catching the end of his words. "You were never not good enough," she said firmly. "You were just convinced you had to earn what was already freely given." "And the second bravest thing?" Freya asked, not to be diverted from her original question. "Holding you for the first time," Bjorn continued. "This tiny, perfect person who would depend on me to keep her safe and happy and help her grow into whoever she was meant to be. That was more terrifying than any Draugr. More terrifying than breaking a centuries-old curse?" "Much more terrifying," he said seriously. "Because breaking the curse only had to happen once. Being your father happens every day for the rest of my life." Freya nodded as if this made perfect sense. "So the adventure isn't really over. It's just different now." "Exactly," Bjorn agreed, pulling her into a hug that smelled like wood smoke and safety. "The adventure of figuring out how to be happy." Outside their windows, the aurora continued its ancient dance, beautiful and natural and entirely free of supernatural significance. It was, he thought drowsily as his family settled around him, the most magnificent sight he had ever seen. The next morning arrived with the soft gray light that followed winter storms, gentle and unassuming. Bjorn woke naturally for the first time in months, no urgent pull of worry dragging him from sleep, no ancestral whispers threading through his dreams. Just the quiet sound of Astrid's breathing beside him and the distant cry of gulls returning to calm seas. When he emerged from the bedroom, he found Freya at the kitchen table, carefully drawing in her school notebook. Her tongue poked out slightly in concentration as she worked, and Bjorn paused to watch this perfectly ordinary scene with wonder that felt almost sacred. "What are you drawing, little one?" She looked up, her face bright with morning energy. "Our adventure. For when I'm grown up and maybe forget exactly how it happened." She turned the notebook so he could see her work. Stick figures that were unmistakably their family, standing before a cottage while green lights danced overhead. "But I'm not drawing the scary parts, just us being together at the end." The simple wisdom of it struck him speechless. His daughter understood something that had taken him decades to learn, that the story worth preserving wasn't the darkness they had faced, but the light they had chosen to return to. "That's perfect," he said, settling beside her. "Should we make breakfast? Your mother will be hungry when she wakes up." They worked together in the small kitchen, Freya standing on a chair to reach the pan while Bjorn diced potatoes and onions. The familiar rhythm of cooking together felt like a meditation, each small task grounding him deeper in the present moment. When Astrid appeared, drawn by the smell of frying fish, she found them debating whether eggs should be added to their concoction. "Always add eggs," she declared with mock authority. "It's the first rule of breakfast." "What's the second rule?" Freya asked, cracking shells with enthusiastic imprecision. "Cook with people you love," Astrid replied, wrapping her arms around Bjorn from behind and pressing her face against his shoulder. "Everything tastes better that way." As they ate, conversation drifted to ordinary concerns, whether the storm had damaged any nets, what Freya had missed at school, whether Mrs. Larson's chickens had weathered the weather safely. Bjorn found himself contributing naturally to these small discussions, no part of his attention reserved for watching doorways or listening for supernatural whispers. The cottage felt exactly what it was, a safe harbor containing everyone who mattered. Later, when Freya had bundled off to school with promises to draw more pictures of their peaceful morning, Astrid and Bjorn walked down to the harbor together. Other fishermen were already at work, inspecting their boats and gear, calling greetings across the water. Bjorn waved back, feeling the easy camaraderie of shared purpose settle around him like a comfortable coat. "You know what's strange?" Astrid said as they examined his boat for storm damage. "3 days ago, I was terrified this life wasn't enough for you, that you'd always be looking past it, waiting for something greater to come along." Bjorn tested a rope, finding it secure. "And now? Now I see how you look at everything. Really look. Like you're seeing it for the first time. The way you watched Freya drawing this morning like she was performing magic instead of just being 8 years old." Astrid smiled, her hands working automatically to coil a line. "You finally arrived in your own life." The truth of it resonated through him. For decades, he had lived slightly ahead of himself, always preparing for the next crisis, the next responsibility, the next test of worthiness. Now, checking his nets in the morning sunlight while his wife worked beside him and their daughter learned arithmetic in the village school, he felt the profound satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. "I keep thinking I should miss it," he admitted, "the weight of carrying something important, the sense of purpose that came with the curse. Do you?" He considered this carefully, watching gulls wheel over the harbor in patterns as old as the sea itself. "No. I think I confused burden with meaning for so long that I forgot what actual purpose feels like." A fishing boat rounded the point, its captain raising a hand in greeting. Bjorn waved back, recognizing young Henrik returning from an early morning run to check his nets. Tomorrow, Bjorn would make the same journey, following the same rhythms his father had followed, and his father before him. Not because ancient blood demanded it, but because this work fed his family and served his community and connected him to the sea that had always been home. "The bravest thing," Astrid said quietly, "isn't facing down supernatural storms. It's choosing happiness when the world keeps insisting you should want something more dramatic." Bjorn pulled her close, breathing in the salt air that carried no whispers of otherworldly obligation. Above them, the morning sky stretched clear and infinite, promising nothing but the gift of another ordinary day. He had finally learned to recognize a miracle when he saw one. The new beginning. 3 months later, Bjorn stood in his garden planting potatoes while spring rain misted the fjord beyond their cottage. His hands worked the dark soil with practiced ease, following rhythms that had nothing to do with ancient bloodlines and everything to do with the simple magic of seeds becoming sustenance. Freya knelt beside him, her small fingers carefully placing seed potatoes in the furrows he'd dug, her tongue poking out in concentration. "Papa," she said, not looking up from her work, "I dreamed about the green lights again last night." Bjorn's hands paused for only a moment before continuing their steady work. Over the past months, both he and Freya had experienced occasional dreams touched by echoes of that supernatural storm, not nightmares, but gentle reminders of the other world they had glimpsed. The village healer, old Ingrid, had assured them such dreams were natural after encountering forces beyond ordinary understanding. "Good dreams or troubling ones?" he asked. "Good," Freya replied firmly. The lights were dancing, but not calling anyone away, just celebrating that everyone was safe and home where they belonged. The wisdom of his 8-year-old daughter never ceased to amaze him. Where he might have worried about lasting effects or hidden meanings, she simply accepted the dreams as part of their story's gentle conclusion. "I think," she continued, patting soil around a potato with maternal care, "the ancestors are happy now. They don't have to keep trying to fix old mistakes, they can rest." Bjorn nodded, understanding that she was probably right. In breaking the curse, he hadn't just freed the women of his bloodline, he had released generations of the dead from their own burden of obligation. The thought brought him profound peace. Astrid emerged from the cottage carrying a tray of hot tea and buttered bread, her hair escaping from its braid in the humid air. She looked younger somehow, lighter, as if she too had shed some invisible weight over these past months. The constant vigilance that had marked their marriage, the careful watching for signs of supernatural influence, the unspoken fear that their happiness was temporary, had gradually dissolved into something warmer and more trusting. "Henrik stopped by while you were working," she reported, settling on the garden bench Bjorn had built from driftwood. "He wanted to know if you'd mentor his youngest son in reading the currents. Says the boy has good instincts but needs guidance from someone who truly understands the sea." The request filled Bjorn with quiet pride. His knowledge was being sought not because of mystical heritage, but because of hard-earned skill and experience. He was becoming what he had always secretly wanted to be, a man valued for what he could teach rather than what he was destined to endure. "I'd be honored," he said simply. As they shared their simple meal in the misty garden, conversation flowing easily between topics both profound and mundane, Bjorn reflected on how thoroughly his definition of contentment had transformed. 3 months ago, he would have been restless on such a peaceful morning, some part of him listening for calls to greater purpose. Now he found infinite richness in the taste of fresh bread, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the warmth of his wife's hand in his. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Astrid said, watching Freya attempt to coax a curious robin closer with breadcrumbs. "We never talk about what if anymore." She was right. The endless cycle of worrying about supernatural threats, about inherited obligations, about whether their happiness could last, all of it had quietly faded. They planned garden layouts and discussed Freya's education and debated whether to expand their cottage, confident that their future belonged to them alone. "I had 42 years of what if," Bjorn replied. "I think I'm done with it." As afternoon arrived, neighbors began stopping by, some seeking advice about weather patterns, others simply enjoying the easy hospitality that had always marked their home, but which felt more natural now that it wasn't shadowed by hidden burdens. Mrs. Larson brought fresh cheese and stayed to argue politics with Astrid. Young Henrik arrived as promised to discuss his son's training, lingering to help Bjorn repair a section of fence damaged by winter storms. When evening came and their guests had departed, the three of them sat before their fire as they had countless times before. But tonight, as Freya read aloud from a book of folk tales and Astrid mended nets by lamplight, Bjorn felt no echo of the restlessness that had once driven him to seek meaning beyond these walls. "Are you happy, Papa?" Freya asked suddenly, looking up from her book. The question would have terrified him once. The assumption that happiness was something he deserved, to claim, to rest in, to trust as permanent. Now he considered it seriously, taking inventory of his contentment like a fisherman checking his nets. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty. "I am completely, extraordinarily happy." Outside their windows, the northern lights painted the sky in familiar green and gold, beautiful, natural, and blessedly free of supernatural summons. Bjorn had finally learned that the greatest adventure was simply coming home to yourself and staying there.